Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So let's get right to it. Thank you both for joining it. I have, been thinking about how to approach the broad subject of profit and purpose. So let me just start out at my most cynical Nixonian self, where I'm most comfortable, and just start from the perspective, because I think it's important to get on the table. Can an oil company find a pathway and purpose that becomes convincing that that tension and that alignment and profit and purpose is real? Let me just put that out there, because I think a lot of people, if we had Exxon up here or Chevron or Total, they would have doubts about that. So how would you, if you were taking them on as clients, either one of you, solve that in a credible way for this public?
Let's just put a baseline here. We all drive cars, right? So I can't hold a company to a higher account than I would hold myself. Regardless, I believe that drilling companies, companies that extract from the earth, have a responsibility to start looking, if they haven't already, at the future, meaning renewable energy,
Right.
solar energy, wind energy, which is now far more affordable. So to me, if we had somebody from one of those companies sitting here, that would be my first question. What are you doing to explore these other opportunities?
And Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, swap. Here we go. There is the product that the company creates, and then there's a way that they do that. I think you have to look at both of those independently and interdependently. And so the product that they create is not, in a lot of our viewpoints, is not helping the earth at all. I think you have to look at how they're doing it. Are they doing it in ways that are creating positive externalities both to their people and to the environment as best they can, as hopefully they're making that transition?
So I think it was an interesting question, because when I look at the kind of broad social goods that we need, and there's a whole variety of things. When you look at today B Corps or others, the pathway to doing good in the world is one that's so diverse. But what I'm wondering, is how we take what used to be a very boutique idea. I mean, we've known each other for years, and you've been one of the leaders, and maybe both of you have, but
I'm just old.
Yeah, Suzanne, no. But I mean, you've been talking about CSR, you've been talking about social good and purpose for as long as I've known you, for a long time. And it used to be a boutique topic.
Mm-hmm.
It used to be a topic that was extraordinary. Now it's become, frankly, more normalized.
Mm-hmm.
But just recently I interviewed the CEO of Allbirds. The Allbirds, you may know, is a shoe. Anybody wearing an Allbirds shoe right now? These are the Allbirds that are completely sustainable. Sustainability is built into every dimension of it, including the shoelaces, which apparently cost twice as much if you have a sustainable shoelace as a not sustainable shoelace. But in it, I asked the CEO, what do you do to get Nike and Adidas to do throughout their firm, not just with a single line, what you're doing? So how do you make this notion of purpose or of sustainability or giving back something's less of a boutique?
Well, study after study shows, and I'm sure most of the people in the audience see this kind of research, millennials and Gen Z want
Right.
to be working
Yeah.
so from a retention aspect, it is the right thing for a company to be doing. It's interesting because you mentioned Nike. Nike 25 years ago was vilified by activists for child labor. And now, when we think of the companies that are pushing the envelope and doing kind of better, Nike is at the top of that list. And from building into their product design sustainability, as opposed to just writing charity. And I don't want to hog the mic.
No,
so.
I'll just piggyback on Nike's story, which I think is an interesting one. They actually, I think it's probably about 7 years ago now, had a party and had a funeral for their CSR department. They killed their CSR department, they put it down, and then they created something called the Sustainable Business and Innovation Practice. And the Sustainable Business and Innovation Practice is integrated throughout their company. What they had historically done is, okay, we'll talk about the design of a shoe. They had at the front end maybe some checklists that maybe designers should be thinking about. And then at the very back end of the process, they have an environmentalist or environmental checklist that they're like, the shoe is good, the shoe is bad. Maybe there's some feedback loop to the designers at the front end. What they decided to do instead is to bring those sustainable designers, and they had a cross-functional team, material scientists, designers, a whole bunch of other people that were embedded in the design process. And then that pushed all the way through. One of the innovations that came from that was this idea of creating Flynet. Flynet is a really, I guess, material efficient way to create a shoe. It actually happens to cost less, and it's become $1 billion brand for them.
And Adidas is using plastics culled from the ocean to make shoes. But I will say Nike also ran into trouble with Me Too just this past spring. So, I mean, nobody's above the law, I guess you can say anymore.
Well, I mean, I think, so what's driving them there? Because I think one of our task today is to look at this. Do you have to be a morally aware, enlightened company to do good? Or does the profit incentive, does greed get you in a good place?
I'll start with that one. So I think that there are one framework that I like to use when I'm thinking about profit and purpose is a profit-purpose tension model or a profit-purpose alignment model. So there are times when the purpose, we'll say in this, when we're using the term purpose, we're saying a social or environmental impact. There's a lot of times what we usually think about is that they're intention. So doing good costs me more than it would to not do good, right?
Right.
There are also some models whereby there's alignment. So a good example of those might be a company called MCOPA, which sells off-grid solar in sub-Saharan Africa. The idea there is the more of those units they put on the roof, the more they're achieving their purpose goals, they're also achieving their profit goals. So I just want to put that bifurcation out there, that there are some models where there is alignment and some models where there are tension. The tension is probably a lot more interesting to talk about, but I just wanted to mention that both exist.
And I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but Unilever's 3 most profitable brands were the brands that they put the most social impact programs into: Ben & Jerry's, Dove, and
we
Lifebuoy.
have Ben & Jerry's here later today.
Yes.
Yeah.
But those three brands within the massive Unilever army were the most profitable. And those were the ones that they were doing the most pro-social programming. So that's a real clear line.
I mean, you consult with so many of these companies, and it does occur to me
Thousands.
that the tension that you laid out there is a real one. An example I find interesting is when you're a foreign company. My friend Bob Horvatz is here, who was with Goldman, kind of looked at global companies doing this, and there's a Chinese company that came in and bought GE appliances. Now, if you own GE stock right now, I'm really sorry. It might go back up again someday. But if you're a GE firm, they're scaling down, they're cutting back, they're doing all sorts of things that are probably undermining the quality of work experience for their employees. Not to take this too far, but when you look at GE appliances we bought in, they're expanding portability of benefits. They're investing in places. They're doing a lot of things that you would imagine around creativity and nimbleness, and giving their workers empowered. And I find it fascinating when it comes to the broad question of empowerment and creating a kind of platform for workers, which has its own social benefits. Whether or not we are in a situation where, when you say there's a race to the bottom and a race to the top, and how do you get more to do the race to the top and understand that becomes, something that becomes financially supportable, viable, and reinforceable?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question becomes, especially when we're looking at workforce development, the question becomes how engaged is the workforce when they show up at the office? Right. Most of us show up to the office, and I'd say I think stats show something about 60% of us are not engaged at the office. It's really... Some
of us are showing up at coffee shops, exactly. Which is the new office, right?
Or your living room.
Yeah, exactly, in the pajamas. So it costs a lot for a company to have disengaged employees, and the question becomes, how do I get the best talent, and how do I make sure that when they show up, they're actually engaged? I think treating them well, studies actually show meaning, mastery, and autonomy are the 3 things that actually allow for engagement. So the meaning piece is am I doing something important? Mastery, am I growing? Autonomy, am I being micromanaged or not?
And there's a new term I just saw was called, instead of employee engagement, which is kind of on the cusp of going out, employee fulfillment, which I think really kind of is the umbrella of what Kyle was just describing.
Susan, what are the best examples of aligned power and purpose out there that we may not know about that you see?
That's a tough one to think on the top of my I would think many of the B Corps. I hold so much respect for
Are there crappy
Patagonia.
B Corps, or are they all good?
Well, we were backstage.
Are all B Corps good, or are some of them faking it?
Can I chime in on that?
Yes, go.
I work with a lot of specifically early stage companies that are, some of which are B Corp certified, some of which are benefit corporations. A lot of them are striving towards being great, but are still struggling on that path, I would say.
But in terms of your question, I mean, Patagonia walks the walk and talks the talk.
Right.
Right. Their brand is aligned with the mission. They bring their employees along. They offer their employees opportunities to be advocates.
Right.
And granted, they're not a massive behemoth company, but they're substantive. So I would hold them in that kind of. To answer your question.
Well, I think any company struggling with it, I want to give them credit. I mean, it's great,
Absolutely.
it's conscious, top of mind,
Absolutely.
maybe hard to do. But what are the companies? I mean, I don't understand the legal dimensions of it well enough. But are there pathways into things like B Corp? You just made this interesting distinction on how, I guess it was Nike that changed from having an environmental office to embedding it throughout the company. So how many approach this as again, back to my cynical, dark self, a fig leaf that haven't incorporated deeply, or look at B Corp and double bottom line as a way. I'm just interested in whether whether there's a path that protects the brand of purpose, if you will.
Meaning, if a company takes a controversial stand?
No, I don't know. I mean, I just think that the question is if this has become such a powerful movement that everyone wants to show they're responsible. But in my view is some probably perform at the highest level, some perform at the lowest minimum level to get that check off.
My take is that there is a spectrum of positive actions, and on the one end is a company that just has corporate philanthropy. Kind of the next step on the spectrum is having some CSR department. I think the interesting thing is not let's make money the normal way of doing business and then let's give a little bit of it away. But when it jumps the chasm into business operations, how do we think about the impact on all of our stakeholders, our employees, our suppliers, our community, the environment, and our shareholders as we're actually creating value? That's when it gets much more interesting. I think the check on the greenwashing or social washing happens with the consumer. So if the consumer, and especially the younger consumer, millennial and below, if they see that your actions are not lining up with what you're talking about, that really kills their vibe, and the chance of having brand loyalty with that target audience is very, very low if you're doing that.
Is there anything out there you feel is too much of a hot potato, too controversial a rail for the corporate sector to touch right now that it should be boldly touching?
10 years ago, we would have thought LGBTQ issues were, off the table for companies. 2 years ago, we would have thought gun issues were off the table. I have to say, the one issue that is going to be the next issue, and you've heard it here first, but that's women's access to reproductive health care. That is kind of the last bastion of where companies have yet to go, but we are starting to see.
Do you want to make an announcement on that?
My firm is actively partnering with an organization that is trying to galvanize.
Can we mention the organization?
NARAL, National Abortion Rights, actually, to galvanize the private sector to step up to state that not only is a woman's career dependent on her ability to have the full menu of offerings, maternity care, fertility, reproductive health care, contraception, and choice, so that she may be able to plan her career. And that is what separates a developed country from a developing country.
And is that in reaction to Hobby Lobby?
Oh, God, no. No. I mean, this is just because if you look at what could be potentially happening, Roe v. Wade, all experts believe
the court and legal dynamics are changing the terrain,
exactly,
right? So for what society's going to do.
Hobby Lobby could have been
let me ask you a last question about both of you, and then I want to go to the audience. I am interested in communities. We've just come through an election, right? And it's very clear when you look at the election.
Last year, you mean?
Well, when you look at what happened, we have a divided country. And so when you mention LGBTQ rights, you talk about a woman's right to govern what she wants to do with her own body. When you talk about guns, bullying, education, women, healthcare, inequality, racial justice, environment and climate. you very quickly get a kind of spectrum where there's one side and there's another. At least I think you do, even though there's probably variance and shades of gray. But how do you go into a place that is not on what I would call the same side of the aisle of views that you may be, and how do you look at purpose in that world? How do you reach? I have a lot of relatives that supported President Trump, and live in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and they're with you guys on some things and not on others. But how do you bring a notion of purpose and profit into an arena where the values and norms they have are so different than I would say probably a lot of folks in this room?
Yeah, I actually think that this is this way of doing business, I've found it to be works very well across the aisle. I think from the my more conservative friends, they would say, this is great, the private sector should be stepping up, and the government shouldn't be forcing me to be doing anything. And my more liberal friends would say, isn't it great that business isn't just about profit, that they're doing some good in the world?
But do you have any examples that you can tell me of, where this is happening?
Well, I think the most clear example that I've seen from state legislatures around the U.S. is actually the passage of the Benefit Corporation Statute. It tends, I think there's 5% no votes in all the 35 state houses that it's passed, and 95% yes votes. So New York was unanimous. New York is a crazy very divided state legislature. So this is an issue that seems to play well across the aisle.
Susan?
I mean, just recently with Nike, with Kyle I can never pronounce his name. You clearly had anger from I don't even know what to call them, right-wing conservatives. But in the end, Nike, which is a behemoth brand.
This is about Colin Kaepernick?
Yeah. I mean, ended up, their recent earnings reports show that they weren't damaged at all. So this is going to play out over the next year as more brands take on.
Right, thank you. Let me open up the floor to questions, comments. Yes, we have a gentleman in front, right over here. Do we have microphones? Scrambling around. Here we go, right here in the front. Yes, sir. She's not going to let you have the mic. I'm sorry.
Most of the discussion so far has been corporate activity.
Right.
But in point of fact, it's not corporate activity because corporations don't do anything. It's individuals within those companies. How do you get to those individuals? Do you start at the university level? Are we so dependent on one inspired individual within an organization? How do you get to those individuals?
It's a great distinction between the corporate as an entity, an aggregate, and then an individual.
Yeah, so, I mean, one of the reasons we saw companies step up to fight gun violence had to do with employee activism. And many companies have employee engagement groups, employee working groups. And if you are working on behalf of a cause, you can find easily within a company who is running those groups. But universities certainly are another way to, get them while they're young.
And I tend to work with a lot of private companies that are younger in their growth trajectory. What I find is that founders of younger companies tend to have these values embedded in them as people, and they tend to want to bring that to work more. And that kind of puts, if they actually do the work around codifying it, it puts a flag up and says, if you're interested in this sort of stuff, this is a good place for you.
Do you do anything with the 1% pledge? Have you heard? So give the audience a quick preview of the 1% pledge.
1% for the planet is a pledge to give 1% of net revenue, so not profit, but net revenue, which is a pretty big number for some companies.
Or equity, or time, or I mean, they're like.
Okay, I'm sorry. We're talking about two different things.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about Salesforce?
Well, no, I just want to say because because I've got I've got Suzanne Bianca later, and I did my reading last night. But the 1% pledge is often for young people or startups or others. It kind of goes to where you're talking about individuals, and it plants the idea for early stage investment of effort, time, and equity in that, which I find to be kind of bridging company and individual along that line. So. Not to steal this show from you for a minute, but yes.
Good morning.
Tell us who you are.
Yes, I'm Nell Derrick Debevoise, founder and CEO of Inspiring Capital. Hi, old friends. And sort of got scooped on this question, but want to hear more about the individual thing Kyle, to your point, the exciting thing is when we cross the chasm from the CSR and the volunteer groups and the holiday, party to paint a wall, which is charming, but, frankly, not changing the world. And I think millennials get that.
Wait, sending investment bankers to Bronx to paint a wall for a day isn't changing the world?
It's sweet. It crowds the subway car.
It's sweet. Yeah.
It's really good for T-shirt companies that make the...
Great for T-shirt companies.
And hopefully those are B Corp T-shirt companies, of which there are some. Yes. So what are you seeing around actual incentives for executives in performance systems around specific pieces of this? I've heard some cool stuff around diversity hiring beginnings. It's hard to do purpose.
Can I just turn the question around, because I want to just play with this individual versus company thing on your side, because I hear this thing, we got to get people and individuals at some core level. But I'm also interested in the broad question of massive companies with massive market power moving into good spaces, right? So there is actually a legitimate question regarding what makes Unilever or Shell or Microsoft or IKEA move something in ways. That's a different side of the dimension than the individual side, and how you create a viral nature there. But do you work?
So you teach your people to do it,
right?
But what are you seeing? Where are they doing it?
Skill-based volunteering is skyrocketing, okay, which is much different than going and painting walls, as you say. Although a painter may beg to differ. But when I think of Microsoft, they give $15,000 matching for every employee. When you add that up, that's billions of dollars over time. Now, granted, that isn't necessarily getting everybody off their butts, but if every single person gives $15,000, the company then matches. Think of the broad implications of that kind of funding. But in terms of companies, more and more are giving paid time off. They're offering opportunities for skill-based. But it needs to be from both sides, from the employee and the directors.
Let's go right over here quickly to Bob Hormats, whom I called out a minute ago. Yeah, the microphone ran away, but it's running back to you from the front here. Bob Hormats.
Hi, Bob Hormats. This was a great conversation. I would like to just add another dimension to it, and that is the technology companies, not for the reasons we've seen. There are a lot of issues that relate to them, and privacy and related issues. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is, how can you mobilize technology companies not to do things for people at the top who know how to use technology, but you made the point that maybe 60% of workers are not engaged. One of the reasons they're not engaged is they think their technological capabilities simply don't permit them to advance. They're behind the curve. Are there things companies can do that help lower income people who simply are not on the technology trajectory to begin with, to get on that trajectory, to move ahead, to feel empowered by technology rather than left behind by
Thank
technology?
you.
I've got
answer.
two answers to that. One is a company named Andela that works with developers in the developing world, and companies here in the U.S. hire them. And the same kind of model happens with a company called SamaSource as well. Those two.
Quick thought, Susan.
Twitter, for instance, created the neighborhood nest in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, where Twitter employees actually teach homeless and impoverished individuals to learn to code. And they have a daycare center so that people who have children and no money for daycare can come in and still learn to code. So
and I would add my two examples are AT&T with its nano degree that comes in and brings people in, and tens of thousands of people that it brings in entry level and trains. And the other is Launch Code by Jim McKelvey, who co-founded Square, which is taking people who had some speed bump in their life, health issue, badly trained, or incarceration time, and basically trains them into world-class coders as well. So thank you very much, Kyle Hadaway and Susan, or Westaway, excuse me, Kyle Westaway and Susan McPherson. Thank you both very much for this great conversation.